Hey guys, I'm Apples and Dragons, and this is Grey Sheep and Hedge Wizards, the show where I talk about these books behind me, A Song of Ice and Fire. I kind of wanted to do a cleaning house episode, where I sort of follow up on things I've talked about in previous episodes that I've been itching to talk about since then. The first thing I wanted to talk about was The Song of Ice and Fire. In The Song of Ice and Fire. I did a 30-something minute episode on it, and I didn't come to any great conclusions, but I thought more about what I can say about that A Song of Ice and Fire passage that you might find interesting and might be helpful on your journey through A Song of Ice and Fire's mysteries. So let me get the passage open and I'll read it again. This is A Clash of Kings. Daenerys whatever. Okay, let me be diligent. Daenerys 5. Oh my gosh. I forgot to light the candles. Let me do that real quick. As the tradition, it goes with the title of the show. A Clash of Kings, Daenerys 5. Dany's gone through her House of the Undying vision quest or whatever, and now she's asking Jorah about them, to see if she can get his help making sense of them. Dany could not let it go. His is the Song of Ice and Fire, my brother said. I'm certain it was my brother. Not Viserys, Rhaegar. He had a harp with silver strings. Ser Jorah's frown deepened until his eyebrows came together. Prince Rhaegar played such a harp, he conceded. You saw him? She nodded. There was a woman in a bed with a babe at her breast. My brother said the babe was the prince that was promised, and told her to name him Aegon. Prince Aegon was Rhaegar's heir by Elia of Dorne, Ser Jorah said. But if he was this prince that was promised, the promise was broken, along with his skull, when the Lannisters dashed his head against the wall. I remember, Dany said sadly. They murdered Rhaegar's daughter as well, the little princess. Rhaenys she was named, like Aegon's sister. There was no Visenya, but he said the dragon has 3 heads. What is the Song of Ice and Fire? It's no song I've ever heard. I went to the warlocks hoping for answers, but instead they've left me with 100 new questions. Cool. So last time I talked a little bit about the fact that the prophecy, the Song of Ice and Fire, is must be a big deal because it's the title of the series. And if you're going to put the title of your series in your story, you want to make it the best of whatever it is. And since it's a prophecy, it must be the story's best prophecy. Or maybe it's, it's unclear what kind of best it might be. Does it mean the most difficult? Or just the coolest? Or the most, the one with the most thematic resonance? Or is it all of those things? So first I want to talk a little bit about Jorah, what Jorah says. Jorah's interpretation is that the promise was broken because the baby was killed. His skull was dashed against the wall, by the Lannisters. And so the promise and the prophecy can't possibly come true because he's dead. There's more than one potential subtext of Jorah's interpretation there. What he could mean is that Rhaegar was wrong about who the prince that was promised would be, or that Rhaegar was wrong that there will be a prince that was promised. In other words, Rhaegar was wrong to believe in prophecy. And so which one do you think Jorah means? That Rhaegar was wrong that the prince that was promised will be Aegon? Or that Rhaegar was wrong that there will be a prince that was promised? Those two attitudes go hand in hand, because the second one is a consequence of the first one. The first attitude is that the text should be taken at face value, because that's what Jorah's doing. He's saying that since Aegon is dead, the promise can't possibly come true. He's also taking the prophecy too literally by conflating promise with prophecy. Because the promise in the prophecy not coming true isn't necessarily the same thing as the prophecy not coming true. So he doesn't distinguish between those two things at all. He's very much taking it at face value, the whole thing. And then being the kind of person who not only takes things at face value, but who identifies with being the kind of person who takes things at face value, is what produces the second interpretation. Because the second interpretation is that prophecies are all BS. You shouldn't read any meanings into them at all, or bother trying to. And you probably shouldn't listen to anybody who's trying to, because those people are kind of nutty or childish or immature. They take the story too seriously. Which is funny because you find the same criticism on that side of it, of the Jorah side, where they see someone taking the story too literally, and they say you're taking the story too seriously. I'm going a little further than I meant to, but so Jorah's interpretation of the Prince That Was Promised prophecy has ambiguous subtext. It could be one of two things, or both things. And I find that those two meanings actually go hand in hand. You find them within the same person most of the time. Where you find the second one, you always find the first one. But where you find the first one, you don't always find the second one, which I think is a little more respectable. It's fine to be someone who doesn't tend to see symbolic meanings in things, or to take prophecy seriously or whatever. But that doesn't mean that everyone else is wrong for trying to see symbolic meaning in things. And with a little self-awareness, you might consider that maybe that's reflective of your limitations rather than theirs. Using the word limitation loosely. So Jorah is very much the kind of guy who doesn't read deeper meanings into things, and who kind of identifies with being the kind of guy who doesn't read deeper meanings into things, doesn't chase prophecy and so on, doesn't put a lot of stake into it. To contrast, Rhaegar seems to be the kind of guy who does tend to read symbolic meaning into things. Maybe not to any particular extreme, but he's definitely, I think, on that side of the symbolism spectrum, so to speak. He says there must be one more. The dragon has 3 heads. Based on that, it sounds like what Rhaegar's doing is that he's heard this prophecy about some heroic savior figure, let's call him. He's the prince that was promised, but his role is to be some sort of savior figure, apparently. He's looking to his house sigil, the Targaryen house sigil, for an indication of how that prophecy might come true in some interpretation. And so the interpretation he's supposing is the one represented in his house sigil, which is a dragon with 3 heads. And I think he's looking back at Targaryen history, the history of his family and his heritage, to see what that symbol means, what it represents. And he sees that it represents Aegon, Rhaenys, and Visenya, and their 3 dragons, and their 3-way cooperation in the conquering of Westeros. So the sigil represents a 3-way cooperation of leadership in the Targaryen family. And that's why Rhaegar thinks that he needs to have 3 kids. Among other things, like, I think the Woods Witch told his dad, Aerys, that the prince that was promised would come from his line. And then Rhaegar can notice, I'm part of Aerys' line, and so will be my children. So maybe it's them. So Rhaegar marries Elia Martell, and he has a baby. It's a girl named Rhaenys. And he's probably thinking, well, I'm glad it's a girl, because the first 3 conquerors, 2 of them were girls. And if I'm going to have 3 babies, and I need 2 of them to be girls, I want the first one to be a girl, because that'll put me at ease a little bit. Or I don't have to worry so much about what the next one's going to be. And then he has a boy, which is probably the best case scenario too, because if he had a second girl and he still needed a boy, he might think, crap, what if I'm only capable of producing girls? I need the third one to be a boy now. He would still need the third one to be a specific gender either way, but with it being a boy, he doesn't have to worry about maybe I'm only capable of producing girls. Which is a silly thing to worry about, but you can see how the worry might creep in anyway. This has nothing to do with what I wanted to talk about. I just thought it was funny to think about the order that they were born and how Rhaegar would feel about it if his goal was to fulfill this prophecy. Attention is kind of drawn to it when Dany thinks there was no Visenya, but he said the dragon has 3 heads. What is the Song of Ice and Fire? It's no song I've ever heard. The prophecy of the Song of Ice and Fire, being the title of the series, is indicative of the particular feeling of revelation that the reader is going to have when he learns what the Song of Ice and Fire is and everything having to do with it. And so I thought I would talk a little bit about that revelatory feeling, because it's really cool. In my video, 5 Trueborn Children, I talked about the symbolic meaning of Jon finding Ghost at the end of the chapter, and how that can align with R plus L equals J. In the R plus L equals J interpretation of that passage, Ghost represents that Jon is actually a Stark, being the son of Lyanna, who was a Stark. And I talked about how Theon makes a rude comment to Jon at the end of that chapter, that comes between the happiness, or the harmony, of Jon and Ghost, because Theon is sort of predicting an ugly future for Ghost and by extension Jon. He's saying that Ghost probably won't live very long because he's an albino, which in dogs and I think animals in general is indicative of genetic weakness. So it's a reasonable prediction, actually. It's just not a nice one to make. But Theon and Jon don't like each other, and they're sort of rivals for the family's attention. So it makes sense that Theon would make that comment. It's just doesn't make it all right. And I also pointed out that you could look at what Theon's saying at the end of that chapter and then summarize it as Theon as being a killjoy between Jon and Ghost's happiness together in an in-story, in-world kind of way. Because if Ghost actually does die, it's going to make Jon real sad, and it's going to suck for Ghost, and his wolf siblings probably would be sad. I don't know. You could look at that line and then define it in terms of Theon as being a killjoy. He's sort of killing the joy and the happiness of the moment. And since R plus L equals J is the explanation that apparently explains the meaning of Jon finding Ghost, Theon ruining the Rhaegar and Lyanna interpretation of the 5 Trueborn Children passage in the very same chapter is pretty noteworthy. And so the cool thing that Theon Greyjoy does in that chapter is that he reveals the author's hand, the author's intentions, when he wrote the story. His intentions with a lot of things, actually, but maybe most obviously in Theon's name, because Theon's name is Greyjoy, and his very existence is what grays out the joy, or the meaning, of the R plus L equals J interpretation of the 5 Trueborn Children passage. Now, it's all well and good to see the author's intentions in the story, but it's not what stories are for. Not really. Stories are for seeing yourself in them. And that leads me to the next passage I wanted to read. But it's not in A Song of Ice and Fire. It's in Shakespeare's Hamlet, made easy version. It's in Act 3, Scene 2. Hamlet is talking to some actors who are about to perform a play. He's just kind of giving them advice about how they should act and do a good job at it. And he says, "Suit the action to the word to the action, with this special observance, that you overstep not the modesty of nature. For anything so overdone is from the purpose of playing, whose end, both at the first and now, was and is to hold, as it were, the mirror up to nature, to show virtue her feature, scorn her own image, in the very age and body of the time, his form and pressure." So that sounds confusing as hell. Let me read the translated version. "Make your gestures suit what you say, and vice versa. One proviso, don't overact. Anything overdone is against the purpose of acting, which was, and still is, to reflect reality, to demonstrate what's virtuous, to expose the deplorable, and to depict faithfully the essential nature of contemporary life." I like form and pressure better than the essential nature of contemporary life. But it's a good translation. It helps make sense of this very old story. And so what he's saying is that stories hold a mirror up to the reader. And your purpose with it has to be to see your own reflection in it. To see what it means about you and the time you live in. And the attitudes of the era. The attitudes that characterize you in not just in the time that you live in, but in the context of all of human history. For example, we in the modern world would all probably kind of agree that we're less violent than the people of history. We're just not that interested in fighting. We very much like not being hurt. We mostly don't have any impulse to hurt other people, or at least the ones we do a good job of controlling them, getting along peacefully. But most of us might disagree that the people of history were smarter than us. You can argue about what smart means or whatever, the difference between knowledge and wisdom, all that stuff. I think we certainly know more, so on the knowledge front, we probably got them beat. But smarter, I don't know about that. Smarter seems to contain wiser, and I'm not so sure about wiser. And so, seeing your reflection in the story and what it says about you as just one insignificant nobody in the context of all of human history who has a particular way of looking at the world that's partly timeless and partly fleeting, is the kind of revelation that the Song of Ice and Fire prophecy will be in A Song of Ice and Fire. And that's why it's the title of the series. Because once you know the answer to it and how it all works and what it all means and all that, you'll hardly be unable to see a reflection in the story and what it says about you and your society and in the context of the people of history, our ancestors. The Song of Ice and Fire prophecy is the prophecy that's going to break the fourth wall, so to speak, because you won't not be able to see your reflection in the story, or the author's reflection in the story through his intentions with it and writing it the way that he did. That was good. I felt like I killed two birds with one stone there, because I had to talk about some 5 Trueborn Children stuff that I wanted to talk about anyway. Was there anything more about 5 Trueborn Children I wanted to add? Let me think about it for a minute. No, I've said enough about 5 Trueborn Children. What else did I want to talk about? To clean house on some of the topics I've touched so far in this show. A storm of swords. Swords. S-words. A storm of S-words. She sells seashells by the seashore. Stupid. Daenerys. Hodor's not his true name. Yeah, this is it. So I did an episode about the Night of the Laughing Tree. I didn't even make it halfway through the freaking Night of the Laughing Tree story. I'm freaking insane. How far did I get? Just the introduction of the Crannogman. Yeah, there was a little bit I wanted to add to the first part of this story. I wanted to talk about the Reeds a bit. So, the Reeds' attitudes. In the Night of the Laughing Tree episode, I said that, well, I guess I should say, to prevent future confusion, in my first Night of the Laughing Tree episode, I drew some attention to the fact that Mira and Hodor, I just read the word Hodor, and then my mouth said it. Mira and Jojen have a completely different attitude about knights than Bran does. This attitude stems all the way back to the Andal invasion, where if you read the histories of the coming of the Andals, you find that actually it was the Crannogs are one of the last few places in that area that was not conquered by the Andals. They couldn't conquer it. And not being conquered by the Andals, the Reeds and the Crannog people were not forced to adopt Andal culture. And that includes basically everything about Westeros that we consider Westeros. It includes knighthood. It includes the faith of the Seven. It includes militant attitudes and tournaments, the whole tournament culture thing. It's a very military sort of culture, the Andal culture, which is, probably the reason they did such a good. They were so effective conquering the continent. But anyway, so the Crannog people, they've still got their old gods, their old values. They don't subscribe to this knighthood thing. I don't detect that they have a particular hatred for knights or knighthood. They definitely don't see them as heroes necessarily, and they kind of see them as invaders, which is at least a mildly villainous sort of role. But I don't think they see them as only invaders. I think they see knights as people who can do good things, sometimes do, and can be a force for good in the world. Just are not always. They have sort of a sober view of knighthood. So the Crannog people are interesting to me in much the same way the northern people are, because they're the last holdouts for the old gods and the old culture that predates the Andal invasion, the First Men culture. But this Crannogman in the story, he's just called the Crannogman in Mira's story, but it's kind of obvious after you've read the story multiple times and been in the fandom talking about the story for long enough. It's considered common knowledge that the Crannogman is Howland Reed, if for no other reason than because he's the only named character in this story who is a Crannogman, except for Jojen, and Jojen's too young to have been at the tourney of Harrenhal. So Mira's telling of the tourney at Harrenhal story starts out with Mira introducing and describing the Crannogman, who knows all this cool nature magic. She calls it the magic of my people. So this is like Crannogman tradition stuff. So he's mastered his own tradition, and now he's leaving home. He's going south to visit the Isle of Faces, where the green men live. Let me read some more of it and give me some more to talk about. Sort of chip away at this Night of the Laughing Tree thing. The lad knew the magics of the Crannogs, she continued, but he wanted more. Our people seldom travel far from home, you know. We are small folk, and our ways seem queer to some, so the big people do not always treat us kindly. But this lad was bolder than most, and one day, when he had grown to manhood, he decided he would leave the Crannogs and visit the Isle of Faces. No one visits the Isle of Faces, objected Bran. That's where the green men live. It was the green men he meant to find, so he donned his shirt sewn with bronze scales, like mine, took up a leathern shield and a 3-pronged spear, like mine, and paddled a little skin boat down the green fork. Bran closed his eyes to try and see the man in his little skin boat. In his head, the Crannogman looked like Jojen, only older and stronger, and dressed like Mira. He passed beneath the twins by night, so the Freys would not attack him, and when he reached the Trident, he climbed from the river and put his boat on his head and began to walk. It took him many a day, but finally he reached the God's Eye, threw his boat in the lake, and paddled out to the Isle of Faces. Did he meet the green men? Yes, said Mira, but that's another story, and not for me to tell. My prince asked for knights. Green men are good too. They are, she agreed, but said no more about them. All that winter the Crannogman stayed on the isle, but when the spring broke he heard the wide world calling, and knew the time had come to leave. His skin boat was just where he left it, so he said his farewells and paddled off toward shore. He rowed, and finally saw the distant towers of a castle rising beside the lake. The towers reached ever higher as he neared shore, until he realized that this must be the greatest castle in all the world. I'm going to pause there. I think that's enough text to chew on for now. He finds Harrenhal. That's where we'll leave off. That's where we'll continue next time. I'm doing the we thing again. That's where I'll continue next time. You can watch if you want. Mira said, the lad knew the magics of the Crannogs, but he wanted more. So, it's made explicit in the story that the Crannogman's reason for going to the Isle of Faces and the Green Men is to learn magic. Magic as compared to the magic he already knows, the Crannog magic. She says we're a small folk, and our ways seem queer to some, so the big people do not always treat us kindly. That foreshadows what happens later in the story, where the squires do not treat the Crannogman kindly. And her people are small. That's the takeaway from that. Which is easy to forget, but very important to remember. All Crannogmen are small. And it kind of recontextualizes one of the powers. Because one of the Crannogman's powers was supposedly that he could run on leaves. And it's one of the least believable of the powers. Like, how the hell do you run on leaves? But since all the Crannog people are small, it kind of makes more sense. But you just have to look at it from like the point of view of a likely observer. So if you're not a Crannogman and you venture into the Crannogs, you've never been there before. You don't know what kind of people are there. You don't know anything about it. And you're at ground level because you're traveling by horse and buggy or foot or whatever. And the first human beings you encounter in the region are small people who can run across the branches of trees like they're running on the ground. From the ground looking up, it might look like they're running on leaves, because trees and their branches are covered in leaves. So it's a description of the Crannogman's abilities that may not be strictly magic, but would appear pretty magical to the observer that they're likely to get, and who's likely to spread the first stories of the Crannogman and what kind of people live in this area that they're exploring. So that's the 100% mundane explanation of that Crannogman power, is that he run on leaves just means run on branches, and it's an area full of trees, and there are small people, so it makes a little more sense, because they weigh less, and they're not going to bend the branches as much, and their feet aren't going to be too big for the branches. They're going to be able to balance on it easier. The like mind part is kind of cool. I've never thought of this, but I'm skipping ahead, damn it. I don't care. I'll go back if I have to. It was the green men he meant to find. So he donned a shirt sewn with bronze scales, like mine, took up a leathern shield and a 3-pronged spear, like mine, and paddled a little skin boat down the Green Fork. So it just occurred to me that the shirt sewn with bronze scales and the leathern shield and 3-pronged spear, like Mira's, might literally be the same ones that the Crannogman wore and carried in the tourney at Harrenhal when this story was actually happening. Because the Crannogman is her dad. It makes a lot of sense that a father would pass down his heirlooms to his child. Maybe less sense to a daughter, but maybe more sense to a daughter in the Crannogs. Maybe more sense to a daughter like Mira, who is very good at hunting and likes the outdoors and all that. If the armor, shield, and spear are actually Howland's, that's pretty awesome. Anyway, the Crannogman's making a pretty dangerous journey. He's alone, apparently, which means he's got to forage for food for himself and shelter and all that along the way. And these are, considered basic skills in their world, but to me it's pretty impressive. There's no safety net in a situation like that. The Crannogman's riding a little skin boat. The first thing I thought when I read that was, I didn't know boats could be made out of skin. So I went down a little internet rabbit hole of looking at boats made out of skin. And it's absolutely a thing. It's pretty cool. Very innovative. It makes a lot of sense. It's hard to find waterproof material in nature. Waterproofing is a big challenge when you don't have access to all the adhesives and mortars and stuff that we use these days. It's like, all right, skin is all one piece. No matter how long you stand out in the rain, the water's not going to get through your skin. That's because skin is naturally waterproof. It's the same with animal skin. But for it to be all one piece, it would have to be a really, really big animal and a really, really small boat. Which, based on the pictures I saw, is in fact the size of a skin boat. It's just going to fit you sitting down and nothing else. Hopefully your bronze scale shield and 3-pronged spear. The journey took him many a day. And then he paddled out to the Isle of Faces. And he met the green men. Mira says yes. But she doesn't say any more about them. Which is a shame. I'd love to hear about the green men. She says, but that's another story and not for me to tell. Are you freaking kidding me? I want to hear Howland's story of the time he met the green men. I need to hear that. That needs to be a miniature novel after he's finished with this series. Howland reads adventures on the Isle of Faces. It would just be like a movie training montage, but the length of a full-length movie. He stayed on the isle for the entire winter, but when spring broke, he heard the wide world calling and knew the time had come to leave. I don't know exactly how long the winter was. Seasons are kind of screwy in this story, and they're hard for me to track. Hard for me to track considering that I've never really actually tried to track them with any rigorousness. It isn't always obvious to me how I should interpret references to a past winter or past season. Even springs, you got one that's like super short. Year of the false spring. Seasons are so wacky and unreliable in this story, but I think they're that way on purpose. Winter in this story represents hard times. And so the Crannogman staying on the isle all winter can translate to the Crannogman staying during the hard times, which might include events more than just those associated with a drop in temperature, such as conflict between human beings, conflict within a family, conflict within his family, unraveling of the society's social fabric, just all the things you could imagine that might characterize hard times. Those are all on the table, I think. But when the spring broke, he heard the wide world calling and knew the time had come to leave. Since winter represents hard times, and summer represents the good times, spring represents the end of the hard times and the beginning of the good times. It's a transitional period from bad to good. That's what spring represents in this story. His skin boat was just where he'd left it. So he said his farewells and paddled off towards shore. This must be the greatest castle in all the world. And it is! It's humongous. And it's also completely unrealistic and unmanageable by any living human beings or group of human beings. And unlike most, if not all, of the other castles of comparable greatness, it was constructed with absolutely zero old gods magic. And I think Harrenhal represents the arrogance of man's intellect. Harren wanted to make a castle bigger than any other castle, and all the castles so far had been made by with magic of some sort, with the help of magic, or magical creatures, or both. And Harren just did it with materials. Just plain fucking, I'm going to bring in tons and tons of rocks from everywhere around me. And I'm going to have tons of people working on it with just plain old sweat, snot, and elbow grease. And I think there's even a legend that he used blood in the mortar. I think that comes from Old Nan. Harrenhal being a tower that symbolizes arrogance on the part of humankind makes Harrenhal a very interesting place to set the story and to set the tourney of Harrenhal, where all these events happened that we love to talk about, with the Night of the Laughing Tree and Rhaegar crowning Lyanna, and Aerys Targaryen's forced abdication, I think it might have been, the conspiracy to overthrow Aerys, and the drama between Aerys and Rhaegar, and the drama between Tywin and Aerys that underlies the whole thing, and the drama between Aerys and Rhaegar, because they're both present. And it was described somewhere, probably the World of Ice and Fire, that the feeling at court between Aerys and Rhaegar was reminiscent of the feeling at court before the Dance of the Dragons, between the Blacks and the Greens. I might have butchered that reference, but I don't think so. And that's where I'm going to pick up next time. This was good. I feel like I said a lot of things I wanted to say about those other topics that I've talked about so far. I have a feeling the tourney at Harrenhal is going to become a very regular one until I get all the way through it. Anyway, I hope you liked it. I certainly love talking about this story. And thanks for hanging out. I'll see you next time.